Welcome to the DRF Sports Podcast, brought to you by DRF Sports. America's most trusted name in horse racing is now providing sports bettors with exclusive data, analytics, previews, videos, and expert picks on all major sports. Bet smarter and have more fun doing it. It's the DRF Sports Podcast, and now your host, Sheldon Alexander. Ready, set, bet.
This is the DRF Sports Pod, episode 30. Make sure you like and follow wherever you get your podcasts. I'm your host, Sheldon Alexander. Now, last week we told you we didn't really believe in the cards, and here come the Rams with the cover and outright win as they pull out the victory on Monday night, 30-23, which is more cash for us on what was a tough weekend, but more on that in a sec. Because first, we got to make sure if you've checked out Cash Grab. Cash Grab is a DRF Sports all-new free-to-play sports prediction game where you can win real money. It's available to every sports fan in the App Store and the Google Play Store. Win real cash prizes every day, as well as a chance to win big money jackpots. All you have to do is download the free DRF Cash Grab app, create an account, and start predicting. Who will win the first quarter? How many touchdowns will George Kittle score? I mean, answering questions like these can end with you making real money. So download the DRF Cash Grab app now and win big. Hopefully we can help you continue to win big here as well, as we do this podcast twice a week. On Tuesdays, we recap the week that was, and on Fridays, it's a Picks Pod. Today, being Tuesday, we're recapping what happened on a wild Week 14, which was big for all of the favorites. Most of the favorites, a lot of the favorites. But either way, we were losing some bets here in overtime, backdoor covers, so much more going on just in terms of how this week played out for us. But despite all of that, we hope that you're still getting your betting information from us here on the podcast, as well as from the DRF Sports Sunday Scoop e-newsletter. If you haven't done so already, make sure you sign up for free at drf.com/sports to receive 2 free weekly newsletters delivered to your email inbox every Friday and Sunday. Both are packed with powerful betting angles you don't want to miss. Again, drf.com/sports for all of the insight and analysis you need to win each and every day. Plus, of course, we go in depth on this podcast. Today's episode, we've got a lot more coming up in terms of our Week 14 breakdown. Tom Brady doing it in overtime. The Bills were so close, almost an epic comeback. So much to talk about in terms of Week 14. And as I mentioned, the favorites were doing it big, which was not good for us. But as we say sometimes, a nice little therapy session needed here. And there's only one guy that can help us out with that. That's my guy, Matt Russell. And luckily for us, he joins the pod right about now. Week 14 is in the books, and so of course I had to bring on my guy, Mr. Matt Russell, to break it all down. And despite the fact that I'm feeling like I'm just hanging on here at the end of this NFL season, it's a reminder of why it's so nice to build up so much equity to start the year. Bottom line though, ending Week 14 with the win as the Rams win on the road as underdogs. Huge victory there. But I want to start here and ask you just what stood out to you in this Rams win, because I know you were on the Rams as well, right?
Yeah, well, that's the thing, right? Like you said, you're just hanging on, and I am too, man. You get to December, and we talked about this last week, right? Like the big picture, the small sample sizes, et cetera, right? And so I don't know about you, but Sunday was just exhausting for me, right? And we'll get into the different games and different elements to sort of why that was what that was. And, you know, you break down the good, the bad, and the ugly or whatnot, right? And we end up like 3-6 on the week. And you just go like, you know, what the hell happened, right? And so, yeah, we'll talk about that. But I get into that game last night really it started in the afternoon when the COVID news hit for the Rams. And when you have the type of day that you have on Sunday where, you know, the stuff that you feel is going pretty well or that should probably get home, all of a sudden doesn't, even though by and large, your handicap was pretty correct here and there. You just sort of feel a little gun shy, right? Like Monday rolls around, you just kind of go like, let's kind of just get out of this week here. Let's just wrap this up. And then all this stuff happens with the Rams, and you just go, okay, another thing that, we're doing this podcast on Fridays. We have no idea, obviously, 48 hours plus in advance that this kind of stuff's going to happen. And you just kind of go, okay, like kind of just stop with the bad breaks here, right? And Jalen Ramsey is obviously one of two guys basically on the Rams defense that actually matter to a game outcome, or at least a part of your handicap, right? Because the defense of the Rams is by and large built around those two guys. And the Cardinals are a team that if you don't have Jalen Ramsey and you have, Orr, I don't think it was Bobby Orr out there as his replacement, and you're just kind of like, oh man, like DeAndre Hopkins, like, AJ Green, this whole full squad of Cardinals. And I still would have bet the Rams at, say, plus 3.5. If we had seen it go through 3, the plan the whole time was to take the Rams plus the 3 points. But that was with Jalen Ramsey, right? That was with a couple of the other guys. Now, the other guys not necessarily all that meaningful, but the Ramsey thing was to me. And so I'm gun shy, and I'm like, you know what? I just want to stay off of this game. Like, we have some teaser legs out there at plus 2.5, kicked up to 8.5, which of course is sort of standard operating procedure, as you know. But, from a side standpoint, you get gun shy because, things are going really badly. Again, by and large, a lot of luck type stuff on Sunday, so that when the middle of the afternoon on Monday, more bad luck type of stuff happens, you just kind of go like, you know what? This might be a little bit of a cold luck streak, right? And when we're talking about point spreads and that sort of thing, luck is really a big, really big element. And we've had such a good season this year, and we'd be remiss if we just assume that it was all us and some like genius of ours. I don't know that there's been necessarily a ton of like good beats, if you will, right? Like games that we had no business winning. By and large, we have just done a pretty solid job of handicapping some of these games and getting the appropriate result. And every once in a while, things are going to kick up where you just sit back and you go, oh, come on, like that is going to happen. And I had that on Monday afternoon. So quote unquote, bad job by me to not like fully go in on the Rams as planned. But when things change, like you should probably change. But the big takeaway for me is the Cardinals, right? Like this team that everybody is trying to tell me is the best team in the league, right? That should be power rated number 1. I don't know what to tell you, right? Like part of the handicap last week was like, this team's a little overrated. And when I see sort of other content people and other shows and whatnot going like, yep, Cards have to be number 1 in your power ratings. Do they? Do they need to be number 1? Like, is that some sort of obligation? Like that's what the standings are for. And we talk about that all the time. And so, yeah, I would have maybe got myself in a lot more trouble by betting the Cardinals if I just assumed that because they're atop the standings, that means that their power rating needs to be really high. But as far as I'm concerned, like we've seen them lose and big time blown out by the Carolina Panthers. Now, everybody make the case, well, that wasn't with Kyler Murray. Okay, but like you're going to give them credit for winning without Kyler Murray as well. And so, the Packers game, obviously, where Aaron Rodgers is working with a bunch of guys off the street, right? They lose that game as well. And of course, we talked about some of the home games early on in the season that could have gone either way. And they just happened to go in the win column for the Cardinals due to missed field goals or, fourth down situations with the San Francisco 49ers. It'd be really interesting to see the San Francisco 49ers play the Arizona Cardinals again, maybe come the playoffs, right? And see where that line would be and what the actual result of that game would be based on how these two teams are playing. But yeah, I mean, this is why I haven't been buying into the Cardinals. This is why we haven't been preaching Cardinals futures. We have just been sort of taking a step back and going like, okay, like there's going to be another shoe to drop here. That's not going to happen necessarily this coming week against the Detroit Lions, but it certainly did on Monday night.
It definitely did on Monday night. And the funny thing to me, when I look at just what the Cardinal season has been, we talked about it on Friday. There's just not an accurate depiction of what they actually are because we spent the last month watching Colt McCoy. So while like their record has been improving and people are expecting you to just look at their record and be like, hey, this is one of the best teams in the league, we don't really know what that team is, which was kind of the point going into last night's game and taking the points. I didn't do that on purpose, but hey, you know what I'm saying. Let's move on though, because there's a bunch of other games that we want to talk about. And the Cleveland Browns win the game 24-22, right? A terrible fact that they were unable to cover 2.5 points on a brutal backdoor cover, not even against Lamar Jackson, but against your man's Huntley, which is a story for another day. Baker Mayfield, there's stories of him and not being happy with the play calling, all kinds of stuff, just making me dislike Baker even more, which is well documented on this pod. Cool. But despite all of that, that's not even what people are talking about in regards to this game.
Right.
And it does kind of, go into point spreads as we're talking about going for 2. I would like to know, and I'm asking this question knowing the answer, I'd like to know your thoughts on this whole thing. And I guess how it kind of played into the point spread in this game.
Yeah. Okay. So, you did mention the Tyler Huntley thing, and that I think is still a story for this day because, we talk about the idea of a bad beat, right? And it's funny. So my colleagues and I over at The Score have a bunch of end of the year content stuff, right? Everybody's kind of doing that thing. So we have this meeting and it's like, okay, let's do our worst beats, best bets, teams that made us the most money, teams that lost us the most money, all of that sort of thing. And so we have this sort of discussion about what constitutes a bad beat. And for me, the reason we take the points a lot of the time is because you're allowed to try to make a comeback. Right? Like that's part of the game. And so to me, it's less of a bad beat when a team late kind of gets back within the number if they are getting points. Not with Tyler Huntley, you're not, right? Like if you're sitting there with a 3 touchdown lead and Lamar Jackson is in a cart on his way out, like you have to close that game out. Like what are we talking about here, right? But when you're afraid of your own quarterback, right? You're more afraid of your own quarterback than you are the other team's quarterback at this point. Like that's just really, really pathetic and really, really sad. And so, we'll talk about another game later on that had a big comeback in it that didn't actually work out from a backdoor-ish type of a cover. But in this case, it's like when you see a 3 touchdown lead in Tyler Huntley, you're feeling pretty good about it, right? And so to me, that actually is a bad beat because every single one of us would have signed up for Cleveland -2.5, Cleveland -3 when we saw Lamar Jackson go out of that game. But this is just one drop in this weekend's bucket of just pure and utter frustration and annoyance. And here's why, because we go and we make these bets or whatever, and stuff happens. And again, in the sea of bets, right? In the giant sea of bet, this is a drop in the bucket and the bucket in the ocean of the bets that we're going to make in our lifetimes. We'll probably forget about this game in mere weeks from now. But while we're doing that, while we're playing all of these games, we have to sit here and we have to listen to the CBS halftime crew, the different officials that come on during these games to tell us about rules and watch all of these coaches make the decisions that they make. And by and large, everybody is just a complete idiot when it comes to this stuff, right? Like, and are paid to know better. And it's not like, look at the guys in the CBS crew, right? They're talking about how crazy it was that he did this in analytics, throw the analytics out the window. I don't care about analytics. It's like, why is analytics such a scary word to people? Like all you have to do is sit back and take honestly 5 minutes, like John Harbaugh, he explained it in like 30 seconds. All you have to do is just take a second to learn. You will feel so much better about just having some knowledge along the way here, that you don't have to be the buffoon on television trying to just be tough guy like it back in my day, right? Like things change, right? I don't do the same stuff I did 20 years ago. So why would you? And the interesting thing in all of this is Phil Simms retired a year before the 2-point conversion was even allowed in the NFL. So it's not like he has any understanding of these game situations. And my buddies and I, and I'm sure everybody sort of were the same at home, like when he was in the booth with Jim Nantz on a weekly basis, it was, oh no, it's like the CBS game. That means we have to listen to Phil Simms in a big game for 3 hours, just making absolute nonsense commentary. And then Tony Romo comes in and he looks like a genius in comparison to Phil Simms, right? Like he makes literally millions of dollars coming off the back of Phil Simms because it's like, oh, somebody with a brain who can make some salient points here. But the problem is it's 2021 and Brian Griese is dying to kick field goals from like 55 yards last night, right? And so the point is like whether it's Brian Griese, Matt Nagy, the CBS crew, all of these people, right, who should know better, who in some cases job it is to watch a lot of football games and be exposed to a lot of end game situations, and they just can't do it. Like, Brian Greasy, what are you doing on Sunday that makes you think that a 55-yard field goal is the right play there? Phil Simms, you're sitting in there with a bunch of TVs and a bunch of people around you. Like, it hasn't come up at any point that going for two early on is the correct move to understand what you have to need the rest of the game. Like, these people who just assume that the 2-point conversion is a given if it's done with 30 seconds left in the game, it just boggles my mind. And it's like, if these people are in charge and paid to do all of these things, right, to have these opinions, to be in control of these decisions, in the case of a Matt Nagy, for example, how are we supposed to try to handicap any of this stuff? Because then John Harbaugh sits up there and he makes all these points, and like, you can skim through any clip, any Twitter tweet essentially of that clip and see people like, well, yeah, still not sure, like, oh, it could go either way on this, or like just flat out, you know, going against it. And you just go like, how are we still here with some of these decisions? And how are we supposed to make any decisions of our own based on the fact that like 98% of the population has no real idea of like just the basic type of math here? We're not talking about analytics. We're not talking about like, oh, it's a 7% difference in win probability if you go for it or versus you kick here, and like having a chart or having a guy up there. It's just basic understanding of logic and game strategy. Do I want to know with 30 seconds left that I now need another field goal, or would I rather know that 6 minutes left in the game, right? Obviously, I rather know that early. You would rather know any decision that you ever have to make. You rather know that early on. You rather have more time. And so it just kind of, you know, on weeks where we're 6-3 or 7-2 or the odd, you know, 8-1 type of week, you just kind of let all of that stuff brush off your shoulder, right? You're like, oh, crazy league. What a bunch of doofs. Like, oh, what a weird scene. On weeks where it's not going that great and you have crazy backdoor covers and then crazy non-backdoor covers and nothing seems to go your way, it just kind of wears on you, right? You just become frustrated with all the people who are just blindly able to, quote unquote, succeed in this league. And we had that this week, whether it was, you know, everybody just blindly betting the favorite and everything kind of working out. Like, the NFL is just built that way, where you have just 1 week and like, it doesn't matter that the people who are putting, you know, favorite parlays together for 13 straight weeks are just getting blown out of the water, right? I tweeted the other day, we talked about this, about November being like the best month ever for sports books, and you and I having a really good November, right? And like, that was a full month of us succeeding while people were apparently historically losing money. And then you just show up on week 14 Sunday and everybody's killing it because all of the favorites are winning. And it's like the previous 13 weeks never happened, right? Like, oh, you can go ahead and erase the ledger from November because everybody did so well this week because all of these big favorites ended up covering. And so like, it's just, the whole thing is just a series of buffoonery, whether it's, you know, these, I hate to use the term, but whatever, square bettors or square halftime show crews or square coaches, Matt Nagy, like admitting, oh, you know what, maybe I should have gone for it on 4th and inches down 11 in the fourth quarter. Like, you think, Matt, like, this isn't just a guy playing video games. Like, you were getting paid handsomely to be one of 32 head coaches in the NFL. Like, it cannot be this complicated for you. You shouldn't need a full night's sleep to be able to come to the correct decision. That's not what the money's for. That is not what you're getting paid for. So like, John Harbaugh, again, you know, we beat up the Ravens because, you know, honestly, I don't think they're that good. And up until Lamar was on a cart, it was kind of just Lamar and then hope for anything else to sort of happen on that team. But like, the reason the Ravens are going to win some of these games and stay in some of these games, right? The reason they're going to beat the Bears on the road. Like, think about that, right? Like, Tyler Huntley goes into Chicago and they somehow win that game. And it's like, yeah, I don't think it had anything necessarily to do with Tyler Huntley. It's like the Ravens can pull that kind of stuff off while the Bears are going to screw that type of stuff up, right? And it's just this like 3-hour like microcosm of Harbaugh trying to explain to all these dopes how football works or how strategy should work. And then Nagy 3 hours later needing 24 hours to convince himself to make the correct decision, right? And it's like, yeah, of course the Ravens went in and beat the Bears by, a field goal or whatever it was 3 weeks ago without Lamar Jackson. Of course, right? And that's what's so frustrating when you see 5, 6, 7 games be double digit, in some cases road favorites. It's because of 32 jobs here. Like 4 guys know what they're doing and like 8 are completely clueless. And it's like, I would love it if every single game was like a 3-point line and we can do some legit handicapping here on who's going to win, like that game last night where you go, okay, yeah, I'll take the 3 points with the Rams because I think the Cardinals are overrated. Problem is, like 8, 10 of these teams are just absolute clown shows out there, and it really kills the product. And as much as like it kind of ended somewhat fun on Sunday, that was 6 hours of dreadful football on Sunday afternoon. And it's because a lot of these teams don't know what they're doing. And it's honestly just not that difficult.
Yeah. I mean, it's a crazy, crazy week. And, that game was insane for so many different reasons because I completely stopped watching. I completely stopped paying attention to it. I was like, oh, Lamar's out. Oh, Huntley's in. All right, cool. And yeah. But you mentioned something else, a big theme of this weekend, and it was all the favorites covering. And a lot of the things that we talked about this season was a crazy record overall of if you were just to blindly just bet underdogs the whole year, you would have been doing pretty well. And then we have a week like this where you have the Titans covering at what? And obviously the numbers I'm about to read are, because depending on when you place the bet and what the final number ended up being, but sure. You have the Titans covering at 8.5. You had the Seahawks covering at 9. You had the Chiefs covering 10. You had Denver covering 10. You had the Chargers also covering 10. Green Bay covering 12.5. Like you had all these massive numbers, and these teams cover super easy in a season where we haven't really seen that at all. Now, my question here is, is this like a trend that we should be looking into for the rest of the year, or just a fluke, because some of these teams, like, and if I point to like, let's say the Raiders, because I took in probably way too much of that game. Is it 1, 2, 3 Cancun mode for a bunch of these teams in terms of just like, or the Jags, for example, where it's just like, yeah, we're done. Like you see Urban Meyer's handshake at the end of that game and you're like, that dude is done.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Well, we talked about it on the pod, and it's funny, because we were on Tennessee, right? And we were on Tennessee relatively heavily, right? I had them in the big contest, all of that sort of thing. And the premise being like, okay, we're now in December and it's different, right? Like the idea that you can just do the same thing in December that you can in September doesn't make a ton of sense. It's more difficult in December. This isn't like, oh, now we know more about the teams, right? It's funny, the different sort of categories that you put, you make bets in, right? So like player props, for example, the more information that you have for player prop betting, the better. And then you can sort of understand, okay, when a player is going to have success against what kind of a team, or how a team uses said player, et cetera, right? And that's great. Problem is for against the spread type stuff, right? Like we now know a lot about these teams. And the problem is a lot of that stuff, when it comes to teams that don't have necessarily a ton of effort left in them, a lot of that stuff can be fraudulent. Whereas in September, we can back a bunch of underdogs. We can play a bunch of underdog money lines because nobody knows anything, right? We're just spewing nonsense basically off of summer and like the echo chamber. And you and I talk about that all the time early on in the season. And that's why some of these underdogs go in cash, because not only do we not necessarily know how much of an underdog a team should be, right? We also know at least that they're going to give an effort. Now we're just kind of randomly putting up double-digit numbers here against some of these underdogs, and also not really knowing what kind of motivation that they're going to have. Now, you mentioned you basically ran through the list, right? Even though they weren't a big underdog necessarily, like I would throw the Jets into that mix. But the funny thing about the Jets is, we talked about that game being +6 and grab that. And like, that's the number. And like, if Kamara and company are announced in, the number goes up and we'll take the Jets +6. Well, Kamara gets announced in, the offensive linemen get announced in, and the line comes down. money came in on the Jets on Sunday. That game closed 4, which is obviously a different situation than 6, right? Like we talked about the idea of the game, you know, if it potentially went to overtime and et cetera, et cetera. Now that game was 16-6 for the vast majority. And then obviously a couple of late touchdowns, real tack on type stuff that turned that game into a blowout. We saw that with Seattle. We saw that with Denver, right? That game's a 14-10 game, I believe in the third quarter, if not late in the second quarter. You know, Chargers, that game's relatively close until the Giants do giant things and allow Herbert to throw a 65-yard bomb with 17 seconds left in the second quarter. And it's like, guess what? Joe Judge, you're in the category, man. You're in there. You're in the buffoon category at this point. And the Giants will keep him on because the Giants are a bad organization. And like, that's just what we've got to deal with on a season to season basis. But the point is, the predictability needs to be that come December, we have to be a little, you know, we always say, take the points, right? And as much as that's successful through September, October, and maybe into early November, that attitude has to change a little bit come December, because it isn't that simple. Because you see some of these teams that are just fine with getting absolutely trucked, right? And like the Jags just don't care. And so, you know, a lot of the times I think we would have been maybe on the Jags plus those points because we don't think that highly of the Titans, but we were able to sniff that one out because like it's kind of obvious, right? Like especially with all the news and reports and stuff that came out of Jacksonville, it's like that one's really clear. The Detroit one, we talked about that opening 7.5, and me being like, yeah, I want to be on Denver here, and then just waiting too long because I thought maybe there was going to be a possibility of getting, you know, only having to give up 7 in that game, and then you wake up and it's 10, and then it's 11, and then it's 12, and you're just like, this has gone off the rails. Like I can't.
How did this happen?
Yeah, and I'm like, I can't bet Denver anymore, right? But like the point is, like I wanted to, but I still am just incapable of like giving up all those points. Like Seattle on the road to Houston, that gets up to 10 at one point. It's like, I can't physically bet Seattle minus 10. Like I know it's Houston. And again, that game was relatively close. That game's a 6-point game in, I believe, the fourth quarter. And then if things just go awry at the end, you just go like, man, if I had just been having that same attitude of September and October and just taking all these points the way that we would have got absolutely blown out, right? But because, you know, of all of these weird situations, like volume was relatively low. And so, you know, we have low volume because all of these games are just kind of garbage games to bet on. And then we just have to rely on things going well for us in like field goal type games. And sometimes they do and sometimes they don't, but it's like, there's 15 games this week or 14 or 15 games. There's 16 now for the rest of the season each week. Like I would like to have 16 games to choose from that I actually want to bet. But we're going to be out here. I mean, luckily, if you want to say luckily, this week we've got Jags and Texans where like that's not going to be a big spread, but it's also not a game that I'm necessarily dying to get involved with just yet. So yeah, like last week sucked because listen, you know, 5, 6, 7 games that are just kind of unbettable. We're able to talk ourselves obviously into the Titans, and that was easy, right? Jacksonville doesn't even score a point. And of course the Titans were going to be, you know, bingo call here. The Titans were going to be our survivor pick this week if we had survived Thanksgiving. So of course that had to be as easy as possible for a victory. And so, yeah, I mean, it's just impossible to kind of get into these teams' heads. But I think it's a pretty easy indication early on. Again, there's still 4 weeks left in the season. We talked about the idea of the calendar feeling like there's probably should only be 2 weeks left in the season, but because of the late start to the season with the way the calendar shook down and the fact that there's an extra week, like this might be just 4 weeks where not blindly, obviously, because you're going to have some competitive teams playing some competitive football, even bad teams like the Falcons, for example, who I think are going to still be competitive because they have somehow 5, 6 wins on their resume. But a lot of these teams in the league now in 2021, like 10 points just isn't that much, right? Like the offenses that we have and the game sort of, you know, being able to cater to those offenses, like you can win a game by 10, 14, 21 points really easily, even if you are down at halftime or the game is really close at halftime, as it was in, say, Green Bay, for example. So, yeah, I mean, the attitude has to change in December. It's weird this year because you're not really sure, okay, like normally by December 1st, I would change that attitude, but there's still 5 weeks left in the season. Maybe I shouldn't. This week was certainly an indication that the attitude has to change for the last week of the regular season, or last month, I should say, of the regular season.
Yeah, and I mean, as we switch gears here from talking about big favorites winning to a couple of games that were actually decided in overtime. And when you lose bets in overtime, no matter which side you're on, it's a tough beat for sure.
Yeah.
But when you're on the Bills at 3.5, right? At plus 3.5. And, there's two ways to look at this because they're getting blown out. They were losing that game by a lot. But to come all the way back and have it go to overtime, and you have 3.5 points, and there's only one way you can lose the bet. And then they throw it to Perryman, who I didn't even know was still in the league. I had to check and be like, wait, is that still the same dude? Where did he come from? I didn't know he was on the Bucs. I didn't know that he was still in the league, but apparently Tom Brady knew.
Yeah. He's aware. He's aware of the roster.
He's aware of what's going on. But how do you handle those beats like that? Is that just kind of like, football?
It was it was when it happened. When you say, how do you handle it? I definitely 24 hours later on Monday afternoon was like, oh, come on. It took me a 24-hour delay for me to just be irate about that game. And so here's sort of the comparison to the Baltimore-Cleveland game, right? Because I think a lot of people would say, well, that would have been a bad beat if Buffalo had covered. And here's the thing, the games are 60 minutes, right? And that's the point of the whole Cleveland-Baltimore thing. You're allowed to try to come back, right? That's, again, why you would take the points. In this case, that's why you would take the full 3.5 points, because that even if there's 2 minutes left in the game and you're down 10, from against the spread standpoint, you are in pretty good shape. And we always talk about the idea. Yeah. We always talk about the idea that okay, if you want to judge your bets in a really hardcore way, kind of stop with about 5 minutes left in the game of any game and sort of say, would I rather be on the side that I'm on, or would I rather be on the side that I'm not on? And if we're talking about halftime, for example, or going, pretty closely into halftime, then you would be pretty happy with being on the Buccaneers. That being said, if you're watching the game and talking about the handicap, and if we pretend, for instance, that we are all knowing, and we go into this game and we go, you know what? I don't know why the Bills would ever run against the Buccaneers. That doesn't make any sense. Just throw the ball with Josh Allen and run the ball with Josh Allen. And then for the first 30 minutes, you go, okay, they're doing that, right? They are doing that almost entirely. They didn't even hand the ball off to a running back at all. And they were using Josh Allen's legs. And we're they're doing what we want them to do. Now, the problem is Tampa Bay is trucking the Bills defense, right? And now we're ready to do a halftime press conference where somebody asks, are you embarrassed? But of course, we can't do that because teams are just not allowed to be embarrassed, apparently. But you at least see that from a game plan standpoint, they are bringing it, right? The coaching staff, at least in this case, from a pregame standpoint, is bringing it. Now, did they keep bringing it from a coaching standpoint in the second half? No, as they decide, hey, Josh Allen, we've got this guy on our team. He's great, short yardage, let's fake a punt instead, right? Now we're going to run the football against the punt defense of the Buccaneers. Now we're going to flat out punt a couple of possessions later down, whatever it was, up 14 points, I think, at that point, right? I'm getting sort of the Green Bay Chicago punt conflated with that. And so you're just okay, you're so close to getting this right? You're so close to doing this correctly. And of course, the Bills slowly make this comeback, and you start to realize, 24-7 isn't the blowout that everybody thinks that it is. Not in this era, and not when you're getting 3.5 points, right? It's just 2 touchdowns. It's 1 touchdown now and 1 touchdown much later on as we're going through sort of the third quarter, right? But of course, because nobody thinks that Tom Brady can possibly be stopped, then, except for, I guess, Sean McDermott, who is willing to punt it back to Tom Brady. But because nobody thinks that Tom Brady could possibly be stopped, it's well, they're just automatically going to get 2 more touchdowns at some point throughout the rest of the game. And it's well, no, that's not necessarily the case, because we have seen plenty of times where maybe for a half, the Buccaneers offense goes a little south here. And so once we get to that 5-minute mark left in the fourth quarter, you got to be pretty, feeling pretty good about Bills plus 3.5. Like, we allowed 55 minutes of gameplay and strategy that maybe didn't work for 3 or 4 drives in the first half. Now we've got 6, 7, 8 drives, and we can allow, again, it's always going to be small sample size with the NFL, but we at least can allow for a little bit more data points here along the way to see if this is going to work, whether it's defensive adjustments or the offense just doing all throws all the time and then mixing in the occasional draw play that was working for like 20-yard shots here and there, but again, having to use that in minimal situations. And so I don't think that would have been a bad beat for Tampa Bay, because you're allowed to try to make a comeback if you have a smart, salient game plan. And then we can see that in the first half. You knew that at the very least, the Bills, I should say, could maybe get through the back door. They do it so well, right, that they get to the 3-point deficit. And if everything had just stopped at that point, we would have been totally content. But the problem is the Bills are allowed to try to come back, and they have to settle for a field goal win. Guess what? We haven't even mentioned them yet. The referees get involved, right? And like Stephon Diggs, whether it was the first half, and everybody laughs it off in the first half because the Bills are getting blown out, but he's literally getting Santa Claused. He's getting, Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeered by a Buccaneers player who's got him by the jersey and is like, on Dancer, on Dasher down the field. And nobody seems to notice that the shirt is like 5 feet long hanging out the back. Like that's a call that gets made all of the time. And we can get ticky-tack about touching and pushing and position. And did the guy's head get turned? We see the call of a guy grabbing a shirt all the time, like literally all the time. It's why they wear those shirts that extend, like that are super stretchy like that. Like it's part of the deal. And so whether it's that call or whether it's the call in the end zone, and there was a whole other call as well that didn't go Diggs' way. I thought Diggs might be invisible. Maybe I'm the only one who sees him. Maybe Josh Allen and I are the only ones who sees him, because apparently the referees aren't watching Stephon Diggs, which is kind of a crazy thing to think about. And then, of course, right, a game-changing play where Mike Evans is able to get the call, which is hilarious because, you're a big basketball guy, I'm a big basketball guy. Like, remember Shaq in the old days? Like, he just could never get any calls, or it felt like that because he was so big, and it was like, Shaq, you only get like half of the foul calls because you're so big. Apparently that doesn't matter for Mike Evans. Mike Evans is so big, it still doesn't matter. He's the guy who is apparently not pushing off. He's not the guy. God forbid Mike Evans would be the guy who's starting contact, who's engaging in contact, as if that's not entirely his game with the size that he has over these corners. Yeah, of course it's the corner who's engaging the contact, sure. Meanwhile, Stephon Diggs is getting twisted and hauled down and tripped in the end zone. And you just go like,
same
it's just
for
one
Gronk.
Of those things. Same for Gronk. Yeah. And so it's like, okay, I guess we're just doing this, right? I guess this is just that week where we're not getting that call and those calls are going against. And then again, we even get the field goal, and you said like, yeah, it never happened. I shouldn't say never happens, but like the one way that we can lose, if the Bucs had gotten the coin toss and just went down and scored a touchdown, like I'd be swearing about the coin toss right now, right? And just being like, oh, bad luck there. 50-50 calls, right? Like we talk about how just games are going to go that way. But it wasn't that, right? They just needed the field goal, and like and Perriman's running clear, and I'm just like, yeah, I mean, somebody could tackle him here, and like no one's even in the frame. No one is even in the frame, and like I guess the good part of all of this is that while Perriman was the guy running down for the touchdown, it could have been worse. It could have been Antonio Brown. Right. He's in there for Antonio Brown, right? Yeah. He's playing the Antonio Brown position. That's the man coverage, like Antonio Brown crossing route that we know that Tom Brady would look to Antonio Brown to do. So at the very least, we don't have to see Antonio Brown do God knows what Antonio Brown was going to do in the end zone for that play. Again, the tiniest of silver linings, as I just, you just take a couple of bullets over the course of a Sunday, like Ravens Browns, where the Bills game just doesn't really, I mean, it certainly resonates, but you just kind of go like, yeah, that's one of these days where honestly, and again, if the game was played next week, like what would you do? Would you take the 3.5 points with the Bills? Absolutely, I would. Would I lay 2.5 with the Browns, especially if I get to start with a 3-touchdown lead and Lamar Jackson is not in this game? Yeah, absolutely, I would. So all of a sudden 3-6 becomes 5-4. And we're sitting here going like, yeah, small winning weekend, like did pretty well, blah, blah, blah. But when those two things go way, way awry and your 3 wins are Titans crush the Jags, pretty breezy. Last night's, +3 or +2.5 that wins outright. And the Cowboys, as dicey as that got, win comfortably in Washington. Like you're sitting there going like, we didn't get any lucky wins, right? But we had two that should have been wins go into the loss column. And so while 3-6 sucks when you just look at it in a binary way, and that's the frustrating part when we talk about this space and people going like, well, what was your record? What was your record? And, you know, again, we talked about it last week where it's like, well, 63 in the contest, 60% on the best bets, but actually like 53 if I had to play every single game. And it's like, we don't go backwards into talking about, well, week 7, like the Patriots lost in overtime with a +3.5 and like that kind of thing, right? So that stuff doesn't matter. And that's why we talk on this podcast, right? Because we want to talk about this. And I'm talking to the listener right now who maybe had those same bets because they're sitting at home going like, man, we got absolutely worked over this weekend. And it wasn't necessarily because of anything we did wrong. We would make a lot of these bets. Again, it's just variance, man. And when people talk about variance, right, it is this buzzword in the gambling space. This is what that is, right? It's bad bounces. Unfortunately, there's enough dumb stuff happening in the NFL, whether it's refereeing, coaching, and whatever, where it just can't be on the field only. And that's the frustrating part on weeks like this.
Yeah. And I mean, that's before even mentioning the Bears and plays that I think people might not have realized that you can't advance onside kick recoveries, right? Like that. And then there was the muff punt and both of those plays. It's like, it's almost like 14 points for the Bears that they just weren't allowed to collect, which again, I know I understand the rules of the game, but I need someone to explain to me why that's a rule.
I can't
like,
explain
what is
that
the benefit of that rule? Nobody knows.
Yeah.
Cool.
Honestly, the advancing the onside kick thing is insane. Like I was like, oh my God, they're going to cover this game on that play because honestly, and like, I come on here saying that, you know, people don't know the rules and they don't know the strategies and all of that sort of thing.
I did not know that
one for me. That was a new one for me, man. I had never seen it. And I thought I was convinced that was a touchdown. But like, by the way, right, again, that game was a perfect sort of microcosm as well. Stupid coaching, right? 4th and inches, Nagy, like anybody else, like honestly, like Dan Campbell would have. Right? Like I can't even put Dan Campbell in the 5 worst coaches in the league. Like, how insane is it that Dan Campbell cannot make the cut of my 5 worst coaches in the league? Because at least I respect his go for it mentality. Whereas like David Culley is atrocious. I didn't even talk about David Culley. Like David Culley is atrocious. He's just like, he's just has to be in the top 5. And like Urban Meyer's got dead eyes and like, and all of these other guys who just are total stooges. I mean, Cliff Kingsbury last night was a mess. And that guy's like top 3 right now in coach of the year. Like this is how, like speaking of things that are insane, how about Cliff Kingsbury being like a coach of the year nominee or like plus 300 right behind Bill Belichick. Bill Belichick didn't even coach this week. And he's got to be odds on at this point to be the coach of the year. And he didn't even have to do anything. Like that's where we're at, where it's just like allow people to do dumb stuff. And it's going to improve the odds for Bill Belichick to be the coach of the year. And so it's Nagy not going for it there. And by the way, like mega ticky-tack call on that punt, right? Where it's like, oh, he was out of bounds for like 2 steps. And like the guy didn't like do laps around the bench. He didn't go grab some Gatorade and come in. Like, why do you need to make that call? Like, is that call really necessary? And you and I talk all the time about referees just making calls instead of officiating the game. Like, that's just a guy who was bored and wanted to throw a flag and be involved in this game somehow. And so like, that's a 50-50 thing. And that's being generous to say that that's a 50-50 call. And Nagy's thing is, again, being super generous to say that that's a 50-50 decision. That's a 99-1 decision where you go for it. And these things, and who knows, right? Maybe the Bears don't get it. I'd like to think with Justin Fields and the way they were able to at least gain yardage on the ground against the Packers, that they would have at least converted that. It wasn't like for the game. The Packers would have given it to them. Like all of this stuff happens and you just kind of go like, honestly, if just we could trust anybody to make a decent decision, referees, coaches, whatever, like this would in theory be a lot easier.
All I can say is after a rough Sunday, I was just happy that I abandoned a lot of solid judgment and went super ham on the Winnipeg Blue Bombers in the Grey Cup. I know you weren't expecting that at all. But I will say I will say this as a lesson. The reason why I did go in, and I don't watch the CFL, not going to claim to be a CFL expert at all, but leading up, I saw a lot of like the experts, people who actually watch, were like, oh no, Winnipeg's the best team. But from doing this pod and talking a lot about numbers and realizing just how lines move, the fact that that line in the Grey Cup, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about this, so I apologize ahead of time, but the fact that that line was 4.5 to start the week, and by the time Sunday rolled around and leading up to game time, it came all the way down to 1. And and just from what we do here, people were able to talk themselves into, oh, Ticats at home. Ticats at home. And I'm looking at that just being like, wait a second here. Let's go. Just throwing money at the Bombers. But yeah, that kind of salvaged my night. And I wanted to give you that surprise live on the air to see your reaction.
Well, honestly, like we talk about the idea of don't just, we handicap games on numbers, not teams, right? Not players, right? Because again, fortunately, like last night, it's like, well, Jalen Ramsey not being in the lineup, like to me, that makes a difference against the Cardinals, right? And we talked maybe about, Trey White not being in the lineup against the Patriots. And it's like, well, is that really going to matter against the Patriots? Because the Patriots aren't going to throw the ball much anyway. And of course, they basically didn't throw the ball in that wind game. Whereas last night, it's like, well, Kyler Murray's going to throw the ball a ton. Like it has to matter that Jalen Ramsey's not in the lineup. Now, maybe if Jalen Ramsey's in the lineup, the Rams win that game by 3 touchdowns and not 1 touchdown. Like maybe that was the difference maker. Maybe the Cardinals are, I don't want to say that bad because I don't think they're a bad football team, but that much below the way that we think that they are. But I would like to, and ideally, right, we always say sort of strip away the uniforms, the branding, the jerseys, even the names on the back of the jersey. And the Grey Cup is kind of perfect for that, right? Where you're like, I don't know anybody on the team. I don't really have any sort of power assumption about the Blue Bombers or the Tiger Cats. I'm just out here playing the number that the odds makers thought was 4.5, and that got bet down to 1. And listen, the Tiger Cats, I know the Tiger Cats were up like 12 points in the fourth quarter. I was that had second screen standard on my on my setup. So like people would say like, yeah, well, they had a 12-point lead, like maybe that was the right move, right? But like again, if you're getting the best of the number, if you're getting Blue Bombers just to win, they're allowed to try to come back, right? And one thing we know about the CFL is like there is ample opportunity to come back in a game the way that the clock works interminably. So kudos to you, man. Like again, you didn't have the branding necessarily to bother you. You didn't have like allegiances to players from, oh, well, this guy won the Heisman or like this, like he's got to be good or whatever.
I'm a big Zach Caleros guy, man.
Zach shout out guy. Cincinnati Zach Caleros, by the way. So I know. I got you. Massive Bearcats year as they're making college football playoffs and they're winning Grey Cuppies.
Speaking of winning bets, though, before we get to the Thursday nighter, because it's a very interesting Thursday nighter, I'd like to think here. Just want to give a reminder that the DRF Sports Sunday Scoop e-newsletter, if you haven't done so already, make sure you sign up for free at drf.com/sports to receive 2 free weekly newsletters delivered to your email inbox every Friday and Sunday. Both are packed with powerful betting angles you don't want to miss. So make sure you sign up for the Sunday Scoop e-newsletter and check out our guy Scott Grambling's weekly 6-pack. The 6-pack was winning again this week, by the way, just giving that the extra plug, but make sure you check that out. Plus Scott's in-depth game previews, all of that and more, drf.com/sports. We've got you covered for everything you need to know from your betting angles. Now, as we look towards a Thursday night football matchup, okay, Chiefs, I've seen this up to 4 now, 4-point favorites on the road against the Chargers. And this is one of those themes because we're into week 14 now. And I got to like kind of figure out, okay, what have I been riding? Do I need to like kind of break off of? And, we talked about the Packers. We talked about the Cardinals. The Chiefs are definitely one of these teams where my initial lean is obviously I got to take the points at home on a Thursday with the Chargers. But I will say the Chiefs are making me kind of nervous in terms of like, are they quote unquote back? Because their defense is kind of falling into place right now.
Yeah. So I get that. And that I think is why it's 3.5, right? Because my numbers come out to like Chiefs by like 1.5, right?
Ooh, okay.
But fundamentally, right, it's because I think I have a pretty pretty solid rating of the Chargers, right? As much as we talk about the idea that the Chargers can play really badly sometimes and they can play really, really well. And a lot of that is sort of built in their coaching variance and the decisions that they make, because when you go for it on fourth down a lot, right? Like that means games can get out of hand pretty quick when you're not getting those fourth down conversions. And it also means that you can win games that maybe you're not supposed to, or maybe win games that, you know, again, I don't know how many teams necessarily would have been hucking it 65 yards down the field with 17 seconds left, even against the Giants, right? But that's an aggressive team. So you're going to blow out teams. You're going to get blown out. They don't really care about losing by 7 points, do the Chargers, right? And so that's the scary part, is like, yeah, the Chiefs could win this game by 7. They could win this game by 21 if that fourth down leverage type stuff doesn't work for the Chargers. But at least you know that they're going in with that attitude, right? They are going in with that. We're going to try to win this game. We're not going to kick a bunch of field goals unless we absolutely have to. Like all of this stuff that beats teams. When the Chiefs were at their peak over the last couple of years, right? Teams would beat themselves by playing old school football, right? By like these guys who have they're head coaches because they've been in football for 20 years, right? Which means they have 20 years ago attitudes that they have to get past, right? And that's why you have some of these younger guys. I mean, listen, some of the younger guys we expect to be advanced and they're not, but in Brandon Staley, at least we know that his decision-making is going to be advanced. Now, from a football side of things, like we're going to need Keenan Allen in this game, right? Like that's a key element when it comes to converting third downs. A pretty key element when it comes to converting fourth downs, right? Austin Eckler went out of the game. They say that he should be okay. We're going to need him back as well. And by the way, there was a handful of COVID situations that were happening. Obviously, Keenan Allen being one of them. So you're never really sure necessarily about what's going to happen there. So first and foremost, we got to wait until Thursday to make this bet. But I think if we do, it's not like we're going to lose a ton when it comes to line value. Now, maybe this number goes down to 3 if we do, but again, people are back in on the Chiefs. And again, I don't blame them, right? But it's 2 wins against the Raiders where like that game was over literally on the first play of the game, right? Where the Chiefs return a fumble on the first play of the game. You're like, oh, okay, well, like I literally don't need to watch another play the rest of the way here because this game is done. Speaking of teams, by the way, that would potentially have packed it in for this season. Now you could 1-2-3 Cancun it when it comes to the Raiders, or you could 1-2-3 the strip right across the street because they have everything they need to be distracted for the rest of the season. Especially some of these guys who don't necessarily live in Las Vegas now have a month of just kind of finishing off the season and doing whatever they want to do. So all that is to say, the number here screams a bet on the Chargers, right? Like that's just kind of standard stuff. And it's not hard to understand, right? Because the Chiefs, people are getting very excited about the Chiefs, et cetera, et cetera. But even when the Chiefs are at their best, what did we always say when they would play the Chargers? Now they would be 6.5, 7.5 point favorites. And we had that sort of cushion to work with. We'd always say, like, even the worst Chargers teams, the Anthony Lynn Chargers teams who made bad decisions from a coaching standpoint, we would say the defense is capable, right? Like the scheme of the defense is the thing. And it's a lot of teams have copied that Chargers defensive approach against the Chiefs. And that's why the offense hasn't been that great. And as much as the 48 or whatever points they scored, like you can look at the numbers, right? Like it's not like Mahomes had 400 yards passing and it was whatever. It was a lot of just Raiders screwing stuff up, short fields, really basic plays that would go for long yardage. The Chargers can stop that. Like that's what we know what the Chargers can do defensively, and offensively they can keep up with the Chiefs. And so I think this is very much like Bills Bucks, where you're going to want to play the Chargers plus 3.5 because it probably shouldn't be plus 3.5. Now, does that guarantee anything? As we know from just basically the last hour of conversation, no, of course it doesn't. Right. But like, that's where I think the value is. And that's where that's the bet that you have to make here and just kind of hope for the best. Now, again, we can wait, because I don't think the line's moving all that much. And if it does, I think it's probably a pretty good sign that the Chargers are live to win this game. Like we kind of, have to keep that in mind. But you need to know who's in the lineup, right? Bosa, is he okay? Eckler, is he okay? Keenan Allen, is he going to be allowed to play in this game? Is he going to test negative enough to be able to do so? And so I think I'm really excited about this game. This game's going to be outstanding. I don't have to tell anybody that, right? The division is on the line. And by the way, like we talked before the season on this podcast, Chargers plus 650 to win the division. And if if I'd said, it'll come down to one game at home, even with them as underdogs, what's the money line right now? Plus 150, plus 160, right? You're sitting there with a division ticket at plus 650. This game might not necessarily clinch it, obviously, but lock it up as far as, listen, the Chargers have the Texans still on the schedule. They have a home game against the Broncos still on the schedule. They have a road game against the aforementioned Raiders still on the schedule. Like, if you have a division ticket on the Chargers, that's what this game, this game is going to decide that by and large. And you're sitting there with a plus 600 type of a ticket instead of the money line at plus 150. So again, win or lose, you are in great shape when it comes to that ticket. And so maybe that's just how you want to play it, where you're just going to sit on that division ticket and be like, yeah, I'll try my plus 600 here that the Chargers win this game, because it's certainly better odds than plus 600 that they do.
Super interesting. And I like the fact that, as mentioned, coming in on the initial lean, understanding why I paused for a second, but still remaining confident in taking the Chargers plus the points. Let's go. Trying to see how confident I'll be as we look ahead towards bowl season, which is on the way. And, a reminder, we'll have a bowl preview coming up on this feed at some point soon. That's a little bit of a tease, but more on that later. But in terms of college football and the bowls, we've talked a lot about the lines and what the line movement could be going on between now and when these games are actually played. So I'm just going to ask you if you've seen anything that's caught your eye so far in terms of line movement.
Yeah, by and large, we've settled in, right? Like that first week, certainly the first day, we talked about that on the Tuesday pod last week, and then a couple of more moves as information comes out and just general, people going, wait, why is this team favored by 1 when this team should be favored by 1, and maybe kicking that up to 1.5, something along those lines. So 3 sort of relatively significant things. 1, the first coming in the semifinal, where Georgia's up to 8.5. And this is a game that I've been waiting. Line's at 7.5. I'm like, can we get 7 here? I want to get, Georgia minus 7. Is that going to happen? And then, of course, and again, why, Monday, 3 weeks before the game or 2.5 weeks before the game, does the line move? Honestly, I really couldn't tell you, right? Because if you like Georgia, if you are one of these syndicates, one of these groups, one of these big money people who move lines, why would you do it on Monday, December 13th? Right? Why would you make that big play on the 7.5? Maybe I missed the line going to 7. Maybe it was -7, -115 for like 5 seconds. And these professional groups who have people just sitting there monitoring, staring at lines, waiting for maybe something to tick down, because I think the public by and large is on Michigan in this game, thinking that they can compete with Georgia. I don't necessarily agree with that. I want to be on Georgia, but I would rather be -7 than -8.5. So it's sort of a back to the drawing board type of thing. But I think a really interesting indicator here that somebody came in on Georgia and either wasn't willing to wait to get -7 or paid for -7 at a relatively discounted price, if enough money. Because if you're a sportsbook, you're sitting there and you're taking a bunch of Michigan money, right? Plus 7.5, plus 8.5, whatever. You're sitting there, and like maybe you're piled up where you've got a ton of Michigan money. You're like, you know what? I want to get some Georgia money in here. Well, just move the number a little bit, right? Move it down to 7. Move it down to 7 -115, and see if you get a little nibble. Because if you get that nibble and a bunch of Georgia money comes back up to even things out, then you just put it to 7.5. Or in this case, maybe a bunch of it comes in, and now you move it to 8.5. And guess what? The Michigan money is going to tick up as well. And so they're basically doing this thing where they're toggling it up, 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 up to get more and more money. And eventually with the idea of either being on the side that they think is the correct side, right? And having more money, say, on Michigan if they think Georgia is the right side in this game, or just playing it straight and managing the sports book. That's what sportsbook managers do. They're not making odds because these odds get put into place. We make the odds in these games, right? I'm going to go on a little diatribe here for a second. The idea that people think that odds makers like Vegas knows, or the odds makers knows. First of all, Vegas copies a lot of money from the Caribbean and the offshore books, copies a lot of lines off of them. But there's a reason lines are really low early on. Right? When we talk about openers, you can't get a ton of money down, whether it's the NFL or college football, because the money or the limits are really low. And that's the price discovery element, right? So the limits are really low, and they could put Alabama -75 against Cincinnati, and then take a bunch of Cincinnati money at really low limits, because they know over the course of the month, they're going to be able to get that back by moving the line down. Eventually, they would find the correct number that would allow for Alabama money to come back in. Now, they're obviously smart enough not to put a 75 up there. They're going to put a 14, right? A very sort of basic key number thing where, okay, go start at 14. If it lands on 14, which a lot of the times it's going to, it's just a refund. But if we find out that we should be having more money, or the line should be higher because more money's coming in on Alabama, then we move the line up and down, et cetera, et cetera. So the point is what sportsbooks do is they're managing their risk, right? That's why they're called risk rooms. That's why it's called risk trading. Like they manage that money. And so in this case, they're managing it right now to take a little bit more Michigan money. Right? Like that's kind of just basic economics at this point. And so obviously they took some Georgia money this past week, and now they want a little bit more Michigan money, and maybe they'll get just dribs and drabs of it. Maybe somebody will come in big on Michigan. But for our purposes, we were hoping to get Georgia -7. We have a couple more weeks to kind of see what we can do. So if 7, I want to say comes back, it's never really existed, but if you can get 7 -115 at some point before the next time we talk about this game, absolutely do that. Now, unfortunately, with this move, that seems a little bit less likely, but I think it at least tells that maybe Georgia is the right side in this game. So a couple other quick moves here that are just worth mentioning, mainly because the Central Florida and Florida game, which when both of these teams were a lot better over the last couple of years, was a game that, people wanted to see. And like Florida was ducking them, but then Central Florida was ducking them. And, there's sort of this rivalry and and we haven't talked about this game at all, but it's really fun that the Bulls are like, no, forget this whole like regular season non-conference, will they, won't they? We are having you guys match up in this bowl game. Now, the problem is neither one of these teams is what they used to be, and this isn't going to settle any score necessarily. But this line opened 6.5 for Florida, and then it moved up 7 through 7 to 7.5. And I bet UCF +7, thinking that it was never going to get any better than that. And so I was bummed out that it went to 7.5. It's like, oh my God, I missed out on +7.5. What a fool. Well, it's actually flipped back across 7 where there's 6.5s out there available. Like NFL college football show. Like, can you remember a time where a line went from 6.5 to 7.5 and back to 6.5 across that obviously very key number of 7? Like that just doesn't happen. And it's not like there's some massive injury news. Florida's going to have the opt-outs that Florida always had. They had opt-outs last year when they were in a New Year's 6 game, right? Kyle Pitts, I think Kyle Trask opted out, but Kadarius Toney definitely did. And so I imagine the good players, right, the draft eligible players for Florida aren't going to play in this game. And that's why I like one of the reasons why I like Central Florida in this game. But interesting to see that move from 6.5 to 7.5 back to 6.5. Probably settles in at 7 because that line move is pretty wild. Speaking of line moves and a weird sort of move in and of itself, Zach Calzada, our guy, the quarterback for Texas A&M, the guy who pulled the upset against Alabama, has entered the transfer portal. And so this line that had moved against Wake Forest, where Texas A&M was 3.5, 4-point favorites, had moved all the way up to 7, even some 7.5. Speaking of line moves that cross 7, he announces that he's not going to play in this game, that he's transferring out of Texas A&M, which makes a lot of sense. They're not going to let him play next year. They're going to have healthy, better quarterback options. Problem is they don't have those right now. So who is going to play quarterback for the Aggies? And so this line has ticked backwards towards where it opened up. It's sitting around 5, right? In the, as you like to call it, the Vegas zone. And so that's a little bit interesting because it's like, who's going to play quarterback for Texas A&M? And how much is that going to matter? Because Texas A&M's defense can probably do pretty well against Wake Forest's offense. And the run game, it just might be a situation where some guy comes out and just hands the ball to the Texas A&M running backs and just gets out of the way. And they still could potentially win this game. So it's funny. I'm sitting there with a -4 Texas A&M ticket, and I'm loving life when it's -7, -7.5. But right now it's back to where you can get that at a pretty decent price. You just have to do so without knowing who your quarterback is going to be in that game. And that's not the most unusual situation this year because there's a couple of spots where we don't know who the quarterback is going to be in some of these bowl games. So just interesting to see that we just kind of ended up where we started from there with a couple of these games as we get closer and closer to bowl season kicking off, which of course they do on Friday.
Speaking of a couple games here, We got Middle Tennessee versus Toledo, Northern Illinois versus Coastal Carolina, both double-digit spreads. You know how I love to discuss double-digit spreads as I continue to learn more, and I'll always say my initial lean is to take the points. But here, is that the same way that I should be thinking about this, or no?
So, I mean, this is sort of a microcosm for the whole bowl season, right? And the line comes out on that Sunday after when everything gets announced, and you go, you have your numbers, you're frantically like putting these numbers together, and you're going, okay, this team, okay, this team, and this team. All right, who should be favored by how much, right? So let's look at the Middle Tennessee game for a second here, right? Middle Tennessee is the 91st ranked team in S&P Plus, which is, you can find that on ESPN, right? Like it's this sort of advanced analytic metric ranking of the teams based on the teams that they've played and their general efficiency, right? Middle Tennessee is 91st, and that still might be high relative to the fact that, speaking of quarterback issues, they have a full set of quarterback issues themselves, right? Most of that comes from the fact that their offense isn't very good. It is also 91st in the country. Toledo, not amazing. Toledo, that's a team that offensively in the past is a bit of like the brand, if you will, but they were only 60th in the country. They're 50th overall in the country, but 20th in defense. So I don't know how Middle Tennessee is supposed to score in this game, right? If you've got the 91st best offense going against the 20th best defense, that's probably a recipe for disaster. And so I go and I make that bet on that Sunday for -9 on Toledo because I don't think the number's correct. And now the number crosses over 10 and is now 10.5. And you have to make the decision. Am I buying back on Tennessee, or am I just Middle Tennessee, or am I going to just take it and keep the number that I have with Toledo? Based on what I just told you about the offense defense mismatch, I have to keep the 9.5, right? Like I have line value. I have, not the most key number of all time here, but there's very much reason to believe that Toledo can blow this team out. Why I say all of that is the other game that day, Northern Illinois against Coastal Carolina. Same exact circumstance, which is kind of weird. There's only 2 games. Both of them open 9-point spreads. I go and I say, that's not enough, right? Like we need, that's a little bit, too low, because Coastal Carolina is the 12th ranked offense in S&P Plus in the country, right? When we get that, Grayson McCall, like that, Coastal Carolina obviously had a really good season last year, all of that sort of thing. 25th best team in the country. Obviously the defense leaves a little bit to be desired. Northern Illinois, the 100th best team in the country. There's 130 teams in FBS football. They are 100. They say, how did they get into a bowl game, right? Well, the MAC loads up their schedule so that teams can get 6 wins, because that's all you need. It doesn't have to be 6 wins against good teams. It just has to be 6 wins against teams. So they end up getting 6 wins here. Now, I say that to say, like, Northern Illinois, by the way, like won the MAC, right? They ended up finding their way into the MAC championship game as underdogs to Kent State and won that game comfortably. So as much as they're the 100th best team, the 70th best offense, and the 115th best defense, this is still kind of a scary team that wins football games, right? Like this isn't Middle Tennessee where they're playing a bunch of garbage teams in Conference USA. This is a Northern Illinois team that's playing garbage teams in the MAC. This is a team that like pulls stuff off, right? Like they go into, and we were on them in that MAC championship game because we know that they go into the corners, they go into the dark areas of special teams and like getting turnovers and all of this weird stuff sort of happens. So this is one that if you had to pick, okay, which one am I going to come back the other way and take the 10.5 points on? I would be more likely to do that with Northern Illinois in this game. But this isn't a particularly good game. It's not a particularly good game to bet on. And I certainly wouldn't be taking Coastal Carolina -10, -10.5, but I have a decent price with them at -9. So that's going to be my decision to make. By and large, it's bowl season. You probably are in a pool, et cetera, et cetera. If the number in your pool, and you have to do it against the spread, is 10.5, I would try it with Northern Illinois. I wouldn't bet it at Northern Illinois. Okay. And by the way, if you're in a pool, maybe it's not a spread type of pool. Maybe it's just a straight up type of pool, at which point yeah, you can go ahead and take Coastal Carolina. You can have skin in the game when you're watching it on Friday, and you don't have to bet every single game in bowl season. A nice reminder early on that isn't the case. There'll be plenty of games to bet on come Saturday and beyond.
I mean, you don't have to, but I mean, right. Why not?
Right. Of course. Sure. Well, that's a great thing about pools, right? That's a great thing about pools.
Yeah.
You're betting on it without really betting on it.
As we enter into bowl season, obviously the people will be wanting to hear a lot more from you, especially as these lines and line movement continues to occur. So with that being the case, where can the people find you online to keep updated on just what you're thinking, where you might be laying some points here and there, just what's going on in the world of Matt Russell?
Yeah, at mrussauthentic on Twitter, everything you can find there. We're in a little sort of a sleepy week for college basketball. I'm sure somebody out there, maybe not based on the results from this past weekend, has got beat up a little bit on Saturday with college hoops. But we'll get that going, believe me, come conference tournament week. We've had all these big games, right? We've done the sort of Thanksgiving into the Big Ten ACC Challenge and some of these rivalry games over the last few weeks or so, and now teams are just trying to kind of get to the holiday season, right? There'll be some decent games on Saturday. We can talk about those on Friday potentially, but right now we're sort of in this little middle part where these teams are kind of playing these sleepy games, like they just have teams on the schedule, and every night you see, oh, this team lost against this team. Like, oh, they paid them to come and play, right? They call it a buy game where you're buying somebody's attendance so that you can just get them on the schedule. Maybe you rack up a victory. And we have seen that over the last week or so where some of these sleepy type games, guess what, end up in that lower level, smaller conference school. Who cares about the game? Like, they're like, oh man, like we get to play blah, blah, blah. Like, I'm absolutely pumped for this. And so if you're looking just for action over the next 3 days here with not a ton of good games, like the best game on the board is Alabama-Memphis, which sounded a lot better a month ago before we realized that Memphis stinks and Penny Hardaway's outfit is crumbling at this point. Speaking of teams that have lost by games, that's the best game in the next few days. And I don't know how to play that because Memphis in theory should have the talent to at least hang in with whatever point spread that Alabama is going to be favored by here, which I think is probably significant, even though it is at Memphis. But there's 6 games here that are like bye type games where big name teams have the potential to not really care about a game and might get jammed up with a loss. Now, I'm not saying just fire away on the money lines on all of these, but it might mean that we should bet them against the spread. Clemson versus Miami of Ohio. Like, why would Clemson care about this Miami of Ohio team, right? Who is a pretty good team out of the MAC. Texas Tech just got a big win. I think it was just last week in New York. Yeah, it was last week. Just got a big win in New York. They're going to play Arkansas State, right? A Sun Belt team, another team good in their conference, right? That is capable of winning games, might make the NCAA tournament with a nice run in their conference tournament. Texas Tech, what do you care about Arkansas State, right? Oregon against Portland, right? Think about it. Portland cares a lot more about a game against Oregon, a team that is by and large really disappointing, might be the second most disappointing team behind Memphis. Sorry. Portland, I don't think is going to necessarily win that game because they're not nearly talented enough, but we're talking about a team that might be a 20-point underdog that might have a little scrap to them, certainly in the first half, and might be able to stay inside the number. Another one, like all of these sort of feel the same, right? Like USC takes on UC Irvine. Now the Anteaters, you're probably familiar with their work as they've been a tournament team a handful of times in the last decade. And everybody goes, UC Irvine, 14 seed, and then all of a sudden they're giving a 3 seed a scare. UC Irvine is that program in the Big West. USC, what do they care about Irvine coming to town, right? And it's not like this is a road game either for Irvine. It's just straight up the highway, basically, to USC. So that's an interesting game. And then finally, Washington State has struggled, had a little more expectations than they're used to in the Pac-12. They have New Mexico State. Shout out our guy, Pascal Siakam, right? Like the New Mexico State program is a program that doesn't get these opportunities necessarily a ton. And so when they get to play sort of a mid-level Pac-12 team, they're going to be fired up to do it. I don't know how fired up the Cougs are necessarily with Pac-12 schedule on the horizon, holidays and all of that sort of thing. So those are a bunch of games that I'm looking at that maybe you just sort of take the points in every one of those games and just see what happens with some of these mid-level teams. Again, didn't reference any team particularly good. Oh, forgot one more. UNC, Furman, another good program, another team that is in contention and the SoCon to be in the tournament. They're going to care a lot more about this game than North Carolina is. So again, all these middle level teams, Clemson, North Carolina, Texas Tech, Oregon, USC, Washington State, none of those teams particularly good. USC ranked, I think, is North Carolina ranked at this point? Texas Tech, they're on the sort of brink of being ranked. If they're not, might be just kind of sleepwalking through a game here. So that's the type of stuff that on any given day, over at Emrus Authentic on Twitter, whether it's retweeting my stuff over at The Score or just kind of putting some of these theories out there or making some of these plays, that's kind of the thought process behind them. Obviously, we're fortunate enough to discuss thought process here, and Twitter is not really a thought process type of space. It's really just a place to go to celebrate, commiserate, and in this case, complain about the buffoonery that we see in sports, particularly the NFL, on a week-to-week basis.
As always, my dude. Appreciate it for sure. Always getting to break down what's going on inside the lines here in all leagues, the NFL, the NCAA, on the hard court, on the gridiron as well. All things included. Always a pleasure, my dude. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, man. Appreciate it.
Thanks to Matt for coming on the pod. And if you want to follow me online, you can do so on Instagram at Sheldon Alexander and on Twitter at Shell Alexander. Like and subscribe to the DRF Sports Podcast wherever you get your podcasts. And for more on this brand new project for DRF Sports, if you're not familiar with the letters DRF, well, Daily Racing Form has been around for over 100 years, giving you all of the horse racing information, data, and analysis. But now they're taking over the entire sports world. So if you want coverage on every football game, as well as the NBA, MLB, and more, head to drf.com/sports for all of the details and insights, as the site has all of the data on every game, including offensive and defensive stats, betting angles, line movements, key injuries, head-to-head records, and team stats. The DRF data is what powers our power trends. So if you want to see which trends our analysts have selected, follow us on Instagram and on Twitter. And if you want access to all of the raw data, go to drf.com/sports. That's where you get the usual previews. Plus, we go into the games in depth on this podcast. Basically, however you want your betting information, we've got you covered. That's all I got for now on this, the DRF Sports Podcast. Remember to catch us every Tuesday and Friday. My name is Sheldon Alexander, and until next time, see ya.
Thanks for listening to the DRF Sports Podcast. Please subscribe, rate, and review the show. For more sports betting advice, go to drf.com/sports and follow on Twitter at DRF_sports.